All right, so buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving deep into Leviticus chapter 18,
Ooh, Leviticus.
straight from the King James Version, no less.
Wow, going old school.
We're going way back, and to make things even more interesting, we've got Matthew Henry's commentary from 1710 to kind of guide us along the way.
Oh, that's a great addition.
Yeah.
Henry always offers a unique perspective.
Yeah, he really does. And this chapter is all about unlawful marriages and,
Right.
all sorts of fleshly lusts, so it's bound to be a juicy one.
Well, it certainly offers a fascinating glimpse into the social and spiritual landscape of the Israelites back then. It's not just a list of rules.
Right.
It's a window into their world.
So let's set the stage a little bit. The Israelites have just escaped from Egypt. They're heading to this new land, Canaan, and that's where this chapter really kicks off with God laying down the law to Moses.
It's a pivotal moment for them. Imagine going from slaves to a nation, forging their own identity, and God is giving them this blueprint for how to live differently than the people they're encountering.
And he's not mincing words. That phrase, I am the Lord, is repeated constantly throughout the chapter.
Yes. It's like a divine stamp of approval on every single rule. These aren't suggestions, they're commandments.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. A huge chunk of this chapter is about who you can't marry. Parents, siblings, in-laws, step-family, it's all off limits. But why those specific relationships you know?
Well, think about the social dynamics they were trying to build. They were moving from this nomadic lifestyle to settling down, and these laws, they helped establish a stable and cohesive society by drawing these very clear lines within families.
I see. But wouldn't some of these laws actually cause more family drama, like the one about marrying your brother's widow if he passes away?
Well, you have to consider the cultural context. Back then, a woman's security was often tied to her husband's family. This law ensured that she was cared for within that family structure, even if her husband died.
Okay, so it's not just about preventing jealousy or anything like that. It's really about social responsibility and protecting vulnerable people.
Exactly. And it speaks to a God who cares about the well-being of everyone, not just those in positions of power.
So we've got a lot of don'ts around family, and then it takes a turn. The chapter goes on to prohibit adultery and bestiality, which are pretty universal taboos even today, but then things get really intense. There's this part about sacrificing children to Molech.
Ooh, yes. That's where the commentary gets really interesting. Matthew Henry calls it barbarous idolatry.
Wow.
What do you think was going on in those surrounding cultures that made this practice so prevalent?
Well, it's chilling to think about. Why would it have been so tempting for the Israelites, who are supposed to be set apart?
I think it speaks to the power of cultural influence. They were surrounded by people who believed that these practices were normal, even necessary, and God was calling them to a higher standard, a different path.
So it's not just about individual morality. It's really about defying the norms and defining themselves as a nation.
Precisely. And God reminds them that these are the very sins that led to the downfall of the nations before them. Don't make their mistakes, he's saying.
And those consequences are no joke. He talks about the land vomiting out its inhabitants. It's pretty vivid imagery.
Yeah, it really drives home the point that their actions have consequences, not just for themselves, but for their community and even the land that they inhabit.
This idea of the land being tied to the people's actions, that's pretty relevant even today when you think about climate change and how we treat the environment.
Absolutely. It's a powerful reminder that we're all interconnected and our choices really do have these ripple effects.
Okay, so we've talked about the forbidden relationships and kind of the broader social context. Matthew Henry's commentary adds another layer to all of this, though. He argues that sticking to God's laws is the best way to avoid sin.
It's fascinating because Henry didn't see these laws as just a bunch of restrictions. He believed that they provided a framework for righteous living, like a roadmap to a better life.
It makes you think about how rules and boundaries can actually be liberating in a way.
Yeah, that's a great point. By following God's commands, Henry argued, you're actually freed from the tyranny of your own desires and all those destructive consequences that can come with them.
So it's not about blind obedience, it's about aligning yourself with a higher purpose. But how does that translate to us today? I mean, we don't live in the same world as the ancient Israelites.
That's the million-dollar question. While the specific details of these laws may not be directly applicable to us now, the underlying principles, I think, are still relevant. Think about your own life. How did the choices you make shape your world and the world around you?
Ooh, that's something to really chew on. But before we get too philosophical, let's dive into some of the specific examples of these forbidden relationships. I mean, some of them are pretty surprising.
All right, let's unpack a few of the more intriguing ones. Okay, let's take the example of a man not being allowed to marry his wife's sister while the first wife is still alive.
Yeah, that one always jumps out at me. It seems so specific. What's the reasoning behind that?
Well, remember, family units were really the backbone of their society. This law likely aimed to prevent rivalry and tension within households. Imagine the potential conflicts, if two sisters were married to the same man.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Talk about awkward family dinners. So it's not just about preventing jealousy, it's about maintaining that harmony and stability within families.
Exactly. And it probably protected women, too. Can you imagine the power imbalances? If a man could just cast aside one wife for her sister?
That's true. Makes you wonder if some of these seemingly strange rules were actually pretty forward-thinking in terms of social justice.
Yeah, it challenges us to look beyond, our modern assumptions and try to understand the context these laws were created in.
Okay, so we've talked about the, nitty-gritty of forbidden relationships, but let's zoom out a bit. Leviticus repeatedly warns against following the practices of the nations that were driven out of Canaan. What was it about their customs that was so abhorrent?
Well, these cultures worshipped a whole pantheon of gods and goddesses, and their practices often involved fertility cults, ritual prostitution, even child sacrifice. Remember Moloch?
Ugh. Yeah, that was disturbing. It seems like God was drawing a very clear line between the Israelites and the surrounding cultures.
Absolutely. He was calling them to a higher standard, a different way of life. It's like
Yeah.
he was saying, you are my people, and this is what sets you apart.
So it wasn't just about avoiding certain actions, it was about cultivating a distinct identity, a culture of holiness.
Exactly. And that meant rejecting the practices that were so commonplace in the surrounding nations, even if they were tempting.
And the consequences for not following these laws were pretty severe, right? God doesn't mince words. He talks about the land vomiting out its inhabitants if they disobey.
It's powerful imagery, isn't it? It really emphasizes the gravity of their choices. Their actions have consequences not just for themselves, but for the entire community and even the land itself.
Kind of like how we're facing the consequences of our environmental choices today. It's a timeless principle, I guess.
Exactly. The interconnectedness of people, land, and the divine Leviticus highlights that beautifully.
All right, let's shift gears for a moment and bring back Matthew Henry's commentary. He makes a thought-provoking point about adhering to God's ordinances being the best way to avoid sin. What do you make of that?
Well, he believed that God's laws weren't just these arbitrary rules, but a pathway to righteous living. By following them, we align ourselves with God's will and avoid the pitfalls of sin.
So it's less about restriction and more about guidance, like a roadmap to a more fulfilling life.
Exactly. And it raises an interesting question. How can we apply that principle to our lives today? What are the ordinances or guiding principles that can help us live better, more meaningful lives?
That's a big question, especially in today's world where there are so many different moral codes and belief systems. How do we even begin to figure that out?
Well, maybe it starts with self-reflection. What are our core values?
Yeah.
What do we believe in? What kind of person do we want to be?
And how do those values translate into action? It's one thing to have principles, but quite another to actually live by them.
It's a lifelong journey, isn't it? And it requires constant effort and self-awareness.
All right, before we get too lost in the existential weeds, let's circle back to Leviticus 18. One theme that keeps popping up is this idea of purity. It's almost like an obsession. Why was purity so important to the ancient Israelites?
Well, for them, purity was this holistic concept. It wasn't just about physical cleanliness. It encompassed their entire being, their thoughts, actions, relationships with God and each other.
So it was more than just avoiding certain foods or rituals. It was about aligning your entire life with God's will.
Precisely. And it had a profound impact on their daily lives. It influenced everything from their dietary laws to their social interactions. They believed that maintaining purity was essential for maintaining their relationship with God and their identity as His chosen people.
So how does this concept of purity, translate to us in the 21st century? I mean, we don't have the same rituals and taboos.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. While we may not think about purity in the same way, I think there are some modern parallels.
Okay, like what? Give me an example.
Well, think about the things that we consider toxic today. Toxic relationships, toxic workplaces, toxic online environments. We recognize the need to kind of cleanse ourselves from those negative influences, right?
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not about ritual washing or anything. It's about protecting our mental and emotional well-being.
Exactly. It's about being intentional about the things we allow into our lives and the people we surround ourselves with.
So it's less about outward actions and more about cultivating this kind of inner purity.
I think so.
Mm.
Maybe it's about striving for Honesty, integrity, authenticity in our thoughts, words, and actions.
Like a modern-day detox, but for our souls instead of our bodies.
I love that. And just like a physical detox, it requires effort and discipline. It's about making those conscious choices that align with our values and contribute to our well-being.
We've covered a lot of ground in Leviticus 18. The historical context, the specific prohibitions, the emphasis on purity, the consequences of disobedience. It's a pretty intense chapter. But what's the big takeaway for us today?
I think the most important message is that our actions have consequences. Whether it's the ancient Israelites facing the potential destruction of their land or us grappling with the effects of climate change, there's this timeless principle at play.
It's about recognizing that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves, and our choices really do matter.
Exactly. And while the specific rules and regulations may not be relevant for us today, these underlying principles of morality, justice, and respect for others, those are timeless.
Before we wrap up, I want to touch on one last point from Matthew Henry's commentary. He makes this interesting observation about how following God's laws can actually lead to freedom.
Yeah, he saw this paradox in those seemingly restrictive rules. He believed that true freedom comes from aligning ourselves with God's will, not from indulging in, every whim or desire.
So it's not about being a rule follower, it's about finding liberation through a higher purpose.
That's a great way to put it. It's about recognizing that sometimes saying no to ourselves, setting boundaries, and living by a moral code can actually be more liberating than just doing whatever we want.
It makes you think about what true freedom really means. It's not just about doing whatever feels good in the moment, but about making choices that lead to long-term fulfillment and well-being.
And that's a challenge for all of us, isn't it? To figure out what those choices are and to have the courage to make them, even when they're difficult.
Absolutely. Well said. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Leviticus 18, I hope you're all leaving with some food for thought. Maybe even a bit of inspiration for your own journey.
It's been a fascinating exploration, and I hope it encourages everyone to keep digging deeper, keep questioning, keep seeking wisdom from both ancient texts and your own lived experiences.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.